This is the story of Noman Ralph and his wife Sadia Noman. They had been married for 9 years, long enough for the shape of the other person to feel like furniture, present, necessary, and slowly invisible. Noman was the kind of man who showed love through reliability, the paid bills, the remembered appointments, the hand placed on the small of her back in rooms full of strangers. Sadia had mistaken steadiness for indifference, and somewhere in the 6th year, she had begun to feel that she was disappearing inside a life she had chosen. What neither of them ever said aloud, what neither of them perhaps fully understood, was that the real erosion wasn't happening during the arguments. It was happening during the silences they had both learned to call peace. The mornings had a rhythm so practiced it no longer required thought. Noman woke at 6:15, made 2 cups of tea without being asked, left Sadia's on the nightstand with the handle turned toward her side of the bed. He showered, dressed in the bathroom so the bedroom light wouldn't disturb her, and by 6:45 he was at the kitchen table with his phone, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to take up less space. Sadie awoke at 7. She would lie in bed for several minutes, not sleeping, just existing in that suspended space before the day made demands. She would reach for the tea, still warm, and drink half of it before getting up, and she never once mentioned it, not to thank him, not to notice it. It had simply become part of the atmosphere of the house, like the way the second stair always creaked, or the way the kitchen window let in more light than the others. They had a daughter, Miriam, who was 7 years old and possessed of the particular gift of happy children, the ability to fill a quiet house with noise that felt like love. Noman coached her football on weekend mornings in the small patch of grass behind their home in Lahore's older residential quarter. Sadia watched sometimes from the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a fresh cup, and felt something she couldn't name, not quite longing, not quite sadness, something in between. The marriage from the outside was unremarkable in the best sense. They were not volatile people. They did not throw things or say the worst words available to them. What they had instead was a kind of managed distance, polite, even warm, but calibrated. They had stopped asking each other questions that required real answers. It was at a dinner party at Sadia's college friend Hina's house, sometime in February, that Sadia first felt the specific quality of her restlessness become visible to her. The table was loud with talk and laughter, the kind that happens when people are performing enjoyment rather than experiencing it. Sadia had found herself watching a couple across the table. Hina's husband Bilal leaning close to whisper something to Hina, who laughed and pushed his shoulder. And she had felt, with sudden clarity, the absence of that, not the gesture itself, the impulse behind it, the wanting to be near you, that such small gestures carry. She had looked at Noman. He was discussing something with the man beside him, attentive, composed. His collar was straight. His expression was pleasant. He was, as he always was, entirely adequate. She had looked away. The secondary character who had come to matter arrived without fanfare into this dinner conversation. Hina's other friend, Rubina, who worked in marketing and laughed too loudly and had been divorced once and wore the freedom of that fact openly, like a scarf she was proud of. Rubina had a way of listening that felt like permission. She leaned in when you spoke. She asked questions that assumed you were more interesting than you feared. "You seem somewhere else tonight," Rubina said to Sadia on the veranda, where both of them had stepped out with their glasses. "I'm fine," Sadia said. "Then, I'm just tired, I think." Rubina had looked at her steadily. Tired of what? Sadia had not answered that. But the question had followed her home, settling into the passenger seat of the car while Noman drove and Miriam slept against Sadia's arm. She had watched the city lights blur past the window and thought, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And there was something almost worse about that than knowing. At home, she carried Miriam to bed while Noman locked up. When he came to the bedroom, she was already under the covers reading. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. She said goodnight. He turned off the lamp on his side, and the room went half dark. In the space between her reading and sleep, Sadia noticed the empty cup on the nightstand, the morning tea, rinsed and returned without comment as it always was. She looked at it for a moment she couldn't account for. It should have meant something. The trouble was, she no longer knew if it did, or if it was simply the habit of a man who had long ago stopped meaning things and only continued doing them. She turned a page she hadn't read. March arrived wet and gray, and something shifted in Sadia without her entirely authorizing it. She had begun meeting Rubina for coffee on Thursdays. Hina sometimes came, but more often it was just the two of them, and Sadia found herself saying things in those hours that she hadn't realized she was thinking. Rubina had a talent for extraction. She didn't push, but she opened doors and waited, and Sadia had enough things waiting behind doors that she began, slowly, to walk through them. "He doesn't see me," Sadia said one Thursday, and even as the words left her, she felt their imprecision. It wasn't that Noman was unkind. It was something harder to name. "He sees what's useful about you," Rubina offered. She had a way of completing other people's half-formed grievances. The household, the routine, the mother of his child. That's... Sadia paused. "That's not entirely fair. Maybe not." Rubina shrugged lightly. "But is it entirely wrong?" Sadia carried that home with her, and it altered the way she watched Noman in the evenings. She noticed how he asked about Mariam's school before he asked about her day, how he looked at his phone during dinner, not constantly, but enough. How when she said, "I've been feeling a little low this week," he had responded with practical questions. "Are you getting enough sleep? Have you been eating properly?" And not the other kind. Not the kind that said, "Tell me about it. I'm here. Where did it start?" She was not wrong to want more. She knew that, but she was also, and this she did not say to Rubina, not entirely honest about her own withdrawals. She had stopped touching him first. She had stopped asking him questions too, and not noticed that she had. She had interpreted his quietness as withholding without examining whether her own quiet was the same thing. Noman, for his part, felt the shift the way one feels a change in air pressure, not locatable, but physical. He noticed that Sadia returned from her Thursday coffees in a particular mood, not bad exactly, but distant in a way that had edges to it. He noticed that she had stopped meeting his eyes across the dinner table with that small, private acknowledgement they used to have. A glance that meant nothing and everything, the shorthand of people who have shared years. It was gone, and he didn't know when it had gone. He told himself it was a season. Marriages had seasons. He had always believed, reasonably, that if he continued to show up in the practical ways which he understood, which he was good at, the rest would find its own level. What he didn't understand, couldn't see, was that his very reasonableness had started to feel like a wall. In April, at Mariam's school function, a man named Farouk introduced himself. Farouk was the father of one of Mariam's classmates, recently relocated to Lahore from Karachi, animated and easy in the particular way of people who genuinely enjoy other people. He had made Sadia laugh 3 times in 20 minutes, not at anything remarkable, just the ordinary comedy of a school function, but Sadia had registered each laugh the way one registers unexpected warmth. She mentioned him to Noman on the drive home. Mariam's friend, Isa's father. He was funny. Noman was navigating the turn. That was all. But the sat with her the rest of the night. Later, she would understand that what she had wanted in offering that small piece of her evening was for Noman to ask, "What was funny? Tell me." To want to be let into the minor experiences of her day, not because they mattered, but because she mattered. The wanting to be near you, again. The impulse she had watched across that dinner table. Noman, had he been asked, would have said he was simply tired and watching the road. He was not wrong either. That was the trouble with them now. They were both telling the truth, and none of it reached the other. The discovery that closed part 2 was not dramatic. It was a Thursday in late April when Sadia came home to find Noman had rearranged the study shelves, reorganized the books she'd been meaning to organize for months, aligned everything neatly, labeled the file boxes. He had done it to help. He had done it without asking. Sadia stood in the doorway of the study and felt a surge of something that frightened her by its intensity, not gratitude. something closer to fury. She breathed through it. She said, "You reorganized everything. You've been meaning to," he said, looking up from the desk, pleased. She nodded, walked out, made tea. She didn't say, "Those were mine to do. I needed to do something that was mine." She didn't say any of it. But that night, she texted Rubina, "I need to talk." And Rubina, who had been waiting for this particular text, replied immediately. It was Rubina who said it first, as Rubina usually did, casually, the way someone places something on a table and steps back to watch what you do with it. "Have you ever thought about telling him you want a divorce? Not that you do, just to see what he does, to finally get a reaction from him." Sadia had gone still. "Some men," Rubina said, stirring her coffee, "need to be reminded what they have. The comfortable ones. The ones who assume." Sadia shook her head. "That's manipulation." "It's information," Rubina said. "If he comes toward you, you know he cares. If he doesn't, well, also information." Sadia had not agreed. Not that Thursday. But the idea had the particular quality of ideas that frighten you with their appeal. She kept returning to it, examining it, turning it over. She told herself she was thinking critically about it. She was, in fact, rehearsing it. The night she did it was a Wednesday in May. Noman had come home late from a work dinner. Not unusually late, but enough that Miriam was already in bed and the kitchen was cleaned up and the house had settled into its night shape. He came in, loosened his tie and said, "Dinner was long. Are you up?" Which was his way of asking whether she wanted company or had already closed into herself for the night. "I need to tell you something," Sadia said. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, not on the sofa, not casual. He read her tone and sat properly, and his attention, when he finally gave it, was the complete kind. She had always registered this about him without knowing how to receive it. "I want a divorce," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Noman looked at her for a long moment. She had expected, she understood this only in retrospect, something visible, some crumbling, some alarm, some reaching toward her. She had expected, in the most unexamined part of what she was doing, to finally see what she meant to him. To have it surfaced by threat, the way it hadn't been surfaced by ordinary life. What happened instead was that something in his face settled, not hardened, not crumbled. Settled, the way a person's features settle when something suspected is finally confirmed. "All right," he said. The word was not cruel, it was not dismissive. It was simply the word of a man who had already, she understood this in the silence that followed, in the quality of his stillness, been grieving something. "No, man? Have you spoken to someone? A lawyer, I mean, for the process?" His voice was even. "I know. I wasn't. I'll give you space to figure out what you need." He stood. He took his glass to the sink. He was not performing composure. He simply had it, the composure of someone who had been prepared for the terrain he was standing on. "I don't know if she began. "You don't have to explain tonight," he said. "It's late." He said goodnight to her in the same tone he had said goodnight for 9 years, and he walked to the bedroom, and she sat alone at the kitchen table for a very long time. There was no confrontation, no interrogation of her motives, no begging and no accusations. What she received instead was the most disorienting thing he could have given her. He had taken her at her word, and in doing so, he had shown her something she had not expected to see, that he had been living beside a version of this possibility long enough to have already made his peace with it. She texted Rubina at midnight. It didn't work. Rubina replied, "What do you mean? What did he say?" Sadia stared at the screen. Then she put the phone face down and sat in the dark kitchen and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that what she had done was not a test. It had been a door, and he had opened it. The summer passed in a version of normal that was not normal at all. Noman had not moved out. There had been no formal conversation about what would happen next. The word divorce had been spoken and then sat between them like a stone in a stream, with daily life simply moving around it. He continued to make her tea. She continued to drink it. Miriam continued to be the center of everything they did together, which meant they were together constantly in a way that precluded any real reckoning. Sadia told herself this was evidence that he had decided against it, that the all right had been shock, not agreement. She began to reread his ordinariness as devotion, and there was some self-awareness in her about this revision. She knew she was doing it, but knowing you were doing something and stopping it are different skills. In July, she told Hina what had happened. She left out the part about Rabina's suggestion, attributed the moment to a culmination of frustration, her own reaching point, and Hina had listened carefully and said, "Carefully, Sadia, that was a very risky thing to do. What did you want him to say?" "I wanted him to fight for me." Hina had been quiet for a moment. "Have you fought for him?" Sadia had not answered, and Hina, who was a kind woman, had not pressed. The question stayed. Noman, through those summer months, was undergoing something quieter and more significant than Sadia was witnessing. He had, as she suspected, already been grieving, but the grief was not about the marriage ending. It was about realizing that the marriage had, without ceremony, already changed into something he didn't fully recognize. He was a man who processed inward. He did not discuss the evening in the kitchen with anyone, not friends, not his brother Adnan, who lived in Islamabad and who called monthly and who would have listened. He sat with it alone, the way he sat with most things, and what he arrived at was not anger. It was a kind of clarity he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure he was grateful for. He noticed now things he had not allowed himself to notice before. That Sadia's energy returned visibly on Thursday evenings, that she laughed at her phone at the kitchen table with an ease she didn't bring into the room when it was just the two of them. He did not assume the worst in the melodramatic sense. He was not built for dramatic conclusions. What he registered instead was simpler and worse, that she had a life that animated her, and it did not include him. And he had colluded in that separation through years of mistaking his own reliability for connection. He started, quietly, to tend to himself. He called Adnan more. He accepted an invitation from a colleague he'd been declining for months. He joined a morning cycling group because Miriam had asked him to, because she wanted to see him do something he chose for himself. And in the first 3 weeks of riding in the early morning quiet of the city outskirts, he found something he hadn't known was missing, the sensation of being in his own life rather than administering it. He did not do these things to signal anything to Sadia. That was perhaps the part she found most difficult to understand when she began to notice them. She had expected absence, the hurt withdrawal of a man waiting to be asked back. Instead, she found him becoming incrementally more present to himself, and therefore paradoxically more distant from the version of the marriage she had believed she understood. She would come downstairs on Saturday morning, and he and Miriam would already be outside, cycling in the lane, laughing at something, and she would stand at the window with her tea. And the feeling she had, that window feeling, the watching from outside feeling, would be so acute, it would press against her ribs. She tried once to approach it. In August, she sat across from him after Miriam had gone to bed and said, "I think I made a mistake." In May, he looked at her, waited. "What I said, what did you want to say instead?" he asked. She had prepared for this. She had been rehearsing. But the question disassembled her preparation because it was not what she had expected. She had expected forgiveness or accusation, not this. The simple, undefended curiosity of someone asking her to mean what she said. I wanted you to fight for us." It sounded outside her head, smaller than it had felt inside it. Noman was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. He said it without cruelty and without absolution, as though he were confirming a fact. "Then why didn't you?" He looked at the table between them. When he looked up, his expression was not unkind, because I realized that I had been fighting, quietly in ways you couldn't see and maybe in ways that weren't what you needed. And when you said what you said in May, he stopped. I understood that we had been in different rooms of the same house for a long time, and that I had been content to let the wall stand rather than ask what was on the other side of them. It was the most he had said in months. It was the most honest thing she had heard him say in years. It should have been a beginning. She felt it trying to be, but there was a quality to his voice, level, resolved, that told her, though she resisted knowing it, that he was not preparing for a beginning. He was trying to give her something true before the end. Autumn came in golds and a dry kind of wind, and Noman found a flat. He told her in September, a Saturday morning, Miriam at her grandmother's for the weekend. He said he thought it was time to do formally what had been true informally, to give them both the space to understand what they were and what they wanted. He had spoken to a mediator, not a lawyer, not yet. He wanted everything to be handled with care. For Mariam, he said, for both of them. Sadia listened. She had known it was coming, had known it the way you know winter is coming at the first real chill, and yet the knowing did nothing to blunt it. She sat with her hands around her tea and felt the architecture of her mornings dissolving, the cup, the turned handle, the warmth that had been there without announcement for 9 years. "I don't want this," she said. "I know." He said it gently. "But I think you wanted something different that you couldn't name. And I think I stopped being curious enough to help you name it. That's on me, genuinely. But what you did in May and what was underneath it that showed me something about where we actually were. And I've been honest with myself about it since." "You're punishing me." "No." He shook his head, and she believed him, which was almost worse. "I'm not doing this from hurt. I'm doing this because I think we've both been pretending the house is solid when we haven't laid new mortar in years. And pretending costs Miriam something too, eventually." She didn't speak for a long time. Outside, the neighbor's bougainvillea moved against the wall. "What if I'm different?" she said. "What if I could, Sadia?" His voice had that quality again. Not cold, finished. "I think you will be different. I think you're already understanding things you didn't before. But that doesn't mean—" He stopped, chose words with care. "That doesn't mean this is what comes next for us." There was nothing more said that morning worth recording. She cried, not dramatically. The quiet kind of crying that comes when something is real rather than performed. He put his hand briefly on her arm, and then he didn't, and she understood from that touch and its removal that he had said what he came to say. He moved his things over the following 2 weeks. He was careful about it, the way he was careful about everything, taking only what was unambiguously his, leaving the furniture, leaving the study shelves he'd reorganized, leaving the structure of the house intact for Mariam. He was there for drop-offs and pickups. He was not cold. He asked about her parents. He was, in every visible way, the same man she had had her whole married life, attentive to logistics, steady in manner, present in all the ways she had once mistaken for insufficient. On the last morning, he left his key on the kitchen counter, not dramatically, not as a statement. He simply left it because he no longer needed it, and he had always put things where they belonged. Sadia found it when she came downstairs. She stood in the kitchen in the early light, the same light that had come through that window every morning for 9 years. And she held the key and thought about all the small things she had received and failed to register. The turned cup handle, the quiet adjustments, the particular quality of a love that had been so consistent she had read it as ordinary and then as absence, and then too late as its own irreplaceable language. She did not call him. She understood there was nothing to say that would unlock what she had with her own hands come to close. Rabina had gone quiet on her in September, the way people go quiet when consequences arrive without them. Hina had come over twice and said little and been kind. Sadia stood at the kitchen window with her tea, made by her own hands in a cup she'd chosen, with the handle facing whichever way she placed it, and watched the small patch of grass where Noman used to coach Miriam on weekend mornings. The grass was still flat in a circle where they had stood together. She thought, "I was so busy feeling unseen that I forgot to look." It was not a redemption. It was not the arrival of wisdom too late for a story's purposes. It was just a thing she understood now in the body, the way you understand cold when it finally reaches you, not as information, but as actual weather. She had wanted to be desired so much that she had confused the desire with the person desiring her, and she had tested a man who had never withheld himself from her, only expressed himself in a register she hadn't learned to read. He had loved her in the language of presence and routine, and she had waited her whole marriage for him to learn a different tongue. Outside, a child's laughter passed in the lane. The bougainvillea moved. The tea was warm. The key was cold. She set them both down on the counter, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the morning went on without asking her permission. The way mornings do, the way time does, the way most of the things we lose do, without drama, without announcement, simply continuing past the moment we finally understood them.